My name's Mark Easton. I'm indeed the home editor of the BBC, and I'm delighted to be here to chat with my former boss, both at Channel 4 and then at the BBC, now, of course, at CNN, Sir Mark Thompson. Now, you know the advice. Avoid talk about money, politics, or religion. Well, we're going to absolutely do the opposite of that right now in a session provocatively entitled Religion, Politics, and the Media in Trump's America. So before I start with Mark, I want to give you sort of 3 quotes from the American president, which might help set the scene a bit for our discussion. Quote 1, at his inauguration in January, Donald Trump reflected on the attempt to assassinate him in Butler, Pennsylvania, during the campaign. He said this: "I was saved by God to make America great again." That's quote number 1. Quote 2, during a Rose Garden event celebrating the National Day of Prayer last month, the president pondered on the long-standing separation of church and state in America. "Separation, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure," before adding, "we're bringing back religion in our country." And quote 3, announcing the creation of a task force to eradicate what he describes as anti-Christian bias in America, Donald Trump said it was necessary to end the anti-Christian weaponization of government and unlawful targeting of Christians. He also said, "I'd like to be Pope," but anyway, we'll leave that where it is. Last month, he established a presidential commission on religious liberty, which, for our purposes, could be said to be at the very center of a Venn diagram made up of religion, politics, and media. Lots of media on the presidential commission, chaired by a Texan podcaster. Its members include a controversial TV psychologist, a Trump-supporting former Miss California, an author who likens homosexuality to alcoholism, and a shock jock radio presenter who claims Islam is a death cult. So, well, before we get into all of that...
Is there a question in there somewhere?
There is, but I'm not going to get there quite yet. I want to start first, actually, with you, if I may, a personal question. Now, you are a Roman Catholic, and I know you had an audience with Pope Francis shortly before he died this year, and also were back in Rome when Pope Leo was introduced to the world. So how does your faith influence your work?
Well, that's not a straightforward matter. I mean, I think, from the tradition of my faith, the Christian faith, that line of Jesus of Nazareth, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's." He has an idea of appropriate responsibility to the powers and interests of this world, and we're meant to believe a primary duty and responsibility to the kingdom of heaven. But look, I don't want to say any more than I think it does 2 things. I'm interested in religion. I mean, I kind of, put my money where my mouth is in terms of trotting off to church and the rest of it. So I'm really genuinely interested. And I want to say, and I think, thanks to the women and men who educated me and my parents and indeed my wife, I'm interested in religion in the sense that I'm interested in all religion. I'm not just, as it were, interested in my own religion. I find the entire topic and its culture and its history and its beautiful music and literature and all of that intriguing and fascinating, which is not true of everyone in our business by any means. In fact, I think it's probably, if not a rarity, then it's uncommon, I think. Secondly, and I don't want to overclaim here, I put myself very definitely in the category of being a poor sinner, but you hope that the moral dimension of Christianity in my case, but frankly, all of the world's great religions would provide you with some kind of ethical compass for navigating through the stormy, well, and I speak to you as someone who once there was, when I was at the BBC, an attempt to prosecute me for blasphemous libel over Jerry Springer, the opera, if you remember that piece. So not everyone has agreed with this, but in a sense of, with some humility, trying to do the right thing, trying to think through what the right thing might be. I'm hoping that it has some influence there as well.
Interesting. So I scoured CNN's excellent website. I really do recommend it. It's a terrific place to go and find out about the world. And it's got all these tabs. I mean, loads and loads of tabs. You can click on a lot of stuff. Mindfulness, relationships, beauty, pets. But you can't click on religion. There's no tab. I know you've got it's Christopher Lamb, I think, is is somewhere in the room, who is the CNN's religious affairs correspondent based in Rome. But you haven't got a religion tab, Mark. So why not?
Yeah, so the answer is, if we don't, perhaps we should. I don't know. I mean, we do cover religion a lot, and I would say that actually, of the great news organizations I've worked for, at least 4 of them, and I've been involved in several others actually as a non-executive director, CNN is, I think, the one which is most focused on covering religion, with, I would say, a particular focus. You'll understand why on very big events like the death of one pope and the choosing of another, and that will be a very, we're a global broadcaster. It's an amazing spectacle. The whole thing over weeks is and is one of those things that weirdly you can, I think, an audience who would not be generally interested in religious subjects might be fascinated by that process. But in all seriousness, I mean, religion plays a much bigger part in American life than in British life, as it were, for the population at large. Minorities, obviously here as well, often very focused on religion. It more often is woven into political discussion, that being an example. It's very hard to imagine a British Prime Minister of any party, in a sense, speaking of religion in quite that way.
Well, Alistair Campbell famously said, "We don't do God," referring to Tony Blair, didn't he?
Yeah.
So it's a difficult bit of territory.
But I think it's more that there's just a big cultural difference. And it does mean that the religion is taken somewhat more seriously, journalistically, on that side of the Atlantic.
We've got an American Pope. You may have noticed. You were there. Conclaves like to spring surprises, but I wondered how you thought that would play out in Trump's America.
I should tell you the scene, by the way. I was at the CNN camera position in the piazza, and Chris Lamb, I didn't see him here actually, but oh, there he is. Chris is, I'm sort of, I think, squatting on a camera box, and Chris is dressed up in a proper suit and is being interviewed by one of our big anchors, Erin Burnett. Anyway, the smoke comes, electrifying moment, and then, completely electrifying, very emotional moment, actually, unexpectedly for me. But then, some minutes later, a cardinal comes out to the window to say we have a pope, Habemus Papam, and Chris has done this before and is smart enough to hear the surname Prevost in the Latin. Boom, and
that is the most terrifying moment for anybody covering any pope. Who the hell is it?
And I could see in his face, we've got a story. This is one of the, and then the name, and I know enough about these things as well. Leo the 14th, and within half a second, if you are a certain kind of Catholic, you're Rerum Novarum and Catholic social teaching, and what signal is that? And it was a very interesting moment. And by the way, I would say of consternation to quite a few of the American representatives of the church there gathered, because when you thought about an American Pope in the era of Donald Trump, that, Leo's particular story, Peru, a pope of as much of the global south as of the global north.
And he has, before he was pope, he did, I think, retweeted some other social media posts which were critical of Trump. And a lot of people have made.
And Leo, I believe, is, if you want an expert, there's one lounging at the back of the hall. But even I know that Leo has shared one of Francis's main concerns, which is for the particular plight of the world's displaced and dispossessed, and those people are going to wander over.
So where does this go, though? I mean, Trump, famously tweeted a picture of himself dressed as the Pope. We've seen what's just happened in the last week in relation to Elon Musk. He's welcomed the new Pope. Can that relationship survive?
Well, you're asking me to do something I can't do, which is predict the future. Look, I would say that the conclave, the College of Cardinals, has made an interesting choice. A somewhat. I mean, his name was being talked about going in but a somewhat surprising choice. Those of us of Catholic faith believe that the Holy Spirit has a role in this as well. So in this case, the Holy Spirit is thickening the plot a bit. And let's see what unfolds. But I think you have a very interesting choice of a pope who does seem to have a concern for the whole planet, who looks like both a serious man and a man of considerable personal holiness or religious conviction and spiritual depth. Let's see what happens.
Let's talk a bit more broadly about the Trump presidency and religion. As I said in my introduction, a lot's happened even in the last month. And it seems clear to me that he is determined to cast sort of secular liberalism as a threat to religious orthodoxy. Do you think he's serious when he says we're bringing back religion to this country?
You're going to have to ask him that. I don't know whether he's.
But you're sort of. I know you can't predict the future, but you're.
I think there's two things. Firstly, I think his target, it's narrower than a kind of general secularity. He's certainly got in his sights, as part of the culture wars, frankly, often caricatured by the right, a kind of extremely politically correct version of all of this. It's complicated because actually it's not obvious to me that the politically correct wing is necessarily anti-religious, particularly, actually. I think you've got an somewhat old-fashioned humanistic belief, agnostic or atheistic belief in humanism, which I don't think is his target particularly. I've never heard him talking about that. But I think the idea that you've got liberal elite professors who are contemptuous, quite possibly, in his view, guilty of being hostile to religion. Some people on the right have also, well, I think some people have also judged that some of the utterances by professors as well as students at some US universities felt like anti-Jewish racism and anti-Semitism.
I'm going to come on to that.
And so I think he's got a number of targets and wants to broadly present himself who's on the side of religion. But he's not straightforwardly, Mr. Trump himself, someone who is obviously a man of faith. He seems to be respectful of faith, but he's not obviously a man of faith himself. And I think, he's not, a politician who necessarily fully falls into the trap of consistency.
No, no danger of that.
It's not obvious that this adds up to a sort of a plank of public policy at all.
But we've seen in the last month two commissions to eradicate things. One to eradicate anti-Christian bias, as I said, another to eradicate anti-Semitism. Eradicate's a strong word. I'm wondering, it must be some concern for journalists that it becomes much harder to have really free discussions around moral and ethical questions, whether it's about abortion, homosexuality, gender fluidity, and so on.
I think the eradication of anti-Semitism is a desire, and by the way, I would say the same about Islamophobia and other forms of racism. I think probably would be a desirable outcome, actually. Whether his his commission will achieve.
Yeah, but
that,
your point about anti-Semitism was the way he was using it as a way of getting at, say, Harvard and other educational institutions. In other words, it turned it into a political weapon.
That's right, and in ways which some American Jews themselves feel very uncomfortable with, the sense of what's been done, as it were, in the name of protecting them. Even though I would say that anti-Semitism is, as it is in the United Kingdom as well, a real and serious form of racism, and is something which is a real concern and which CNN has done a great deal of reporting on. But we report also on Islamophobia and other forms of prejudice, which is either associated with kind of religion or identity, or both of those things. So, I mean, America's a complex society. It's a very divided society, and one of the axes of division is around religious identity. And there's also a broader thing, which is a feeling, might be shared by some Christians here as well, that public policy concern for minorities and for minority religions has to some extent happened with the effect of minimizing respect and support for larger faith communities. As if, I mean, I'm personally, just as a citizen, resistant to the idea that you've got to choose, and that respect for religion can't simply be a respect for religion, big religions, small religions, ones which feel native and ones which feel as if they've come with immigrant communities into the country. But there are definitely this feeling that there's some kind of zero-sum game, and if special concern is given to this group, maybe it means that we're being ignored, and there may be some truth in that. So I think that you've got, just as you would with other forms of kind of attention, privilege, subsidy, a battle between different groups. Religion is one of the fronts where that's playing out in the States.
We have seen in very recent times some really horrific anti-Semitic attacks in America, and some of the language around that's become much more divisive, more aggressive, and you talk about that polarization. Do you think journalists are religiously literate enough to be able to report in a truly informative way around that territory?
Well, I think in many news organizations, you have the following, really, and Chrislam would be an example. You have some beat journalists who are following religion, covering religion, is what it says on the tin sort of thing. That's their job, who are as expert as any journalists are in any category of coverage. The question everywhere, and I'd say it's a question inside CNN, it's certainly a question in the BBC, ITN, the news organization, the New York Times, is do editors, do the people who make broad decisions about coverage, do they also have this expertise? Do they have sufficient knowledge or interest and commitment? And I would say that although I'd hope that some of us do, I would say that generally in my industry, I would say often you end up with a broader editorial culture which is not particularly interested in, and because it's not particularly interested in, it's not particularly curious about or knowledgeable about religion as a field. And I think, honestly, I want to say, I think part of that, I mean, I'm in my 60s, and I think I grew up, as it happens, partly because I had an immigrant Irish mother, as a Catholic in a country which felt like it was moving rapidly away from organized religion towards a purely secular society, and where most of my contemporaries literally knew almost nothing about religion, to the point of, as we're not having read any of the Bible or not having a kind of elementary grasp of the Bible, or indeed, the Hebrew Testament, the Christian, the New Testament, or of the religion, doctrine of the world's other great religions, just simply didn't think it would come up much. And actually, I always think the kind of satanic verses was a kind of watershed moment where suddenly the sharp edge of religion, the fact that, that we live in a world where the overwhelming majority of human beings have got some level of commitment to religion, 84% of the world's population, probably something like that, and that religion to this day still motivates people to many things, including conflicts and wars sometimes.
You touched on this just now. We've seen Trump courting certain religious groups. I mean, clearly, evangelicals in America. He's very, very keen to court them. In fact, I think he was brought up a Presbyterian, but as now says he's a non-denominational Christian in order to cover all bases. Very good. Perhaps you could just help our audience a little bit in explaining. You said it's a very different kind of society from it is here in relation to people's religious faith and their identity.
Yeah.
To what extent is that?
It's a country of 340 million people. Yeah. It is immensely diverse. Its diversity is a geographical, and in America, geography is also, to some extent, reflects culture and values. The southern states have a different history than the northern states. It's a much less unified country, even historically, in terms of homogeneity than the UK. And religion plays out in many, many different ways in different parts of the country. And politicians who, in federal politics in America, are always trying to gather coalitions. It's competitive coalition building, and the presidential candidate, or indeed the party in Congress, which is the most successful at pulling coalitions together, is the one that succeeds. And so Donald Trump has wanted to get disaffected white voters to support him. He's also done actually a very arguably successful job in reaching out to African-American men in particular and Latino men. And his focus on heartland, in particular white evangelicals, is also combined with a lot of activities to try and focus Catholic interests and Catholic leaders and the rest of it. So there's a lot of filigree in that. But the broad sense of trying to, for example, energize both community leaders and also voters whose, as it were, religiously based conservative values on, for example, gender, could potentially be mobilized in a attack line across from the Republicans to the Democrats about the world's gone mad in terms of transsexuals and the extreme focus on that, and in the military, the argument about bathrooms and toilets, I should say, so there's an attempt to try and siphon off from broadly the more religiously inclined, those people whose religion leads them down a path of conservatism about these kinds of issues, as opposed to a path of liberal tolerance. Some people would argue that the religion, would take you in the other direction. But there are obviously a lot of social conservative religious people in America, and Donald Trump wanted their votes.
He does. I suppose I was asking this question in a slightly different way earlier. It's this notion of sort of liberalism and religious orthodoxy, and the extent to which, in this complicated society that you describe, Trump is using people's faiths and creeds to say liberalism is an attack on you, and that's what all these commissions are about. And that actually there's a lot going on there.
And the commissions are as much about demonstrating that his administration is, in quotes, doing something about it. I mean, given the very strong protections on civil liberties that the Constitution has in place, and which I think even a conservative Supreme Court will probably support, how much will actually change, you could debate. But there are some areas, I think transsexual rights will be an example, where we're seeing real changes. Immigration, we are seeing real changes to administrative practice already. We may see changes to the law and so on. So there is real change in some of these areas. But what I'm trying to get at is, in a way, he's reaching at a cultural thing. Social conservatives, people who are conservative about marriage and about gender, and may also have a view about status in society and different groups and their positions in society. And one of the ways of getting to those people, you can get to them because many of them are religious. Actually, it's the social group he's trying to reach and mobilize. I don't think Donald Trump is very interested in doctrine. And when you talk about orthodox religion, I don't think he's interested in distinguishing between, more orthodox, definitions of Christian or Jewish orthodoxy than lesser. He's interested in mobilizing a social coalition and then using that to gain and retain power.
Are we all right just to keep you for another 5 minutes or so? I'd like to take some questions from the floor. I'm sure there are plenty. Do we have microphones prepared to row? We do. There's a microphone roving beautifully. Thank you.
Catherine Pepinster, thank you, Mark, for your comments. Hello.
Hi, Catherine. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
I was interested in that last point you made when you said that you didn't feel that Donald Trump necessarily had an interest in doctrine. But that made me wonder about your views on his vice president. I wondered if you'd had.
Is this a question about Thomas Aquinas?
I'm getting there. So I wondered if you'd had any contact from Mr. Vance about CNN's coverage of religion, and does he ever pick you up on coverage of doctrine?
Oh, good question.
Well, honestly, and this is a terrible failing in Christopher Lamb there. I would admit we have not done that much on doctrine that I'm aware of to be picked up on. We don't have a view really about the Aquinas' Summa. I've always been more of a Duns Scotus man, really. But
me too.
Yeah. but so the short answer, tragically, for your question, your long and brilliant question, is no, we haven't. To me, what's been happening with conservative Catholics like J.D. Vance and indeed Steve Bannon, and their, I think it's broadly attempt to influence through public remarks and maybe more the course of events inside the Catholic Church and in the Vatican, is a really good example of how religion can absolutely impinge, or real-world politics can impinge on religion in ways which one assumes that even the College of Cardinals took seriously when they were taking their votes. So I think the fact that really serious, powerful political figures in the United States are genuinely trying to advance a broad cultural or political point by getting involved in relatively not obscure quite, but sort of, quite particular questions of doctrine, and I think is a really good example about why we as journalists should take it seriously.
On that point about, we've talked about some awful events in recent times, anti-Semitic attacks and so on. To what extent do you think, should we be worried that this focus on religious differences will actually, become really quite a serious social problem for America?
Well, I think it's already a serious it's already a really serious social problem, and lives are being lost, and a lot of people of many communities. It's certainly true of American Jews, but it's true of Muslims in America. It's true of many other people in America, live lives, fearful lives. And you can't say you're exaggerating, you shouldn't be so worried, because they have a right, and indeed it's reasonable to be fearful. And so I think it's a real issue. Obviously, what one hopes is that tolerance and common sense, which I think are great American values as well as great British values, also have their part to play. Tolerance and the communities reaching out and trying to support each other when they're under pressure, it's true, doesn't make headlines in the way the hate crime does. But as you know from your work for the BBC, that really happens and really makes a difference as well. Yeah. And I think forces of cohesion and of, love of neighbor are real in these countries as well, and hopefully will be strong enough to overcome the hate.
Another question for the floor. Yeah, gentleman down the front here.
Thank you. Hello, Mark. Aaron Kataria, Director of Communications, Lichfield Diocese. We've talked a lot about how religion affects behaviour, how faith influences behaviour, and I think there's an undercurrent in that it's a positive effect. I'd go further. I'd say that for probably all of us in this room, our faith affects our character. Are people in the US who are in your audiences interested in character in their politicians? And are they also interested in what it is that's affecting the character of people that they do the extreme and violent things that we're seeing them do, and they're taking their lead from somewhere?
I've always believed that character is central to political choices. Some of you may have heard me say this before. Aristotle thinks that persuasion, there's kind of three dimensions or three kind of underlying drivers of persuasion. Logos, which is the evidence, the argument, the facts. Ethos or athos, which is the character and deportment and what you know about the speaker. So who's saying this? What do I think about him or her? And then pathos, my mood, the mood of the listener, the mood of the crowd. And I mean, put very crudely, since the Enlightenment, most intellectuals have wanted to believe that it's all about logos, that really it's about policy, it's about facts. It's obviously not. Most people are voting mainly on ethos and pathos, how they're feeling, feelings of anger, feelings of desire for more money, a sense of character. And Donald Trump is clearly got to where he is because a lot of people like the cut of his jib. And as a character, he's one of the most successful, as it were, character politicians who's ever lived. But character's a complicated thing because character may be 2 or 3 super strong traits which just win people over. I think Mr. Trump has had a remarkable ability, particularly given his background, to convince many tens of millions of Americans that he truly understands them and can speak for them. If you said, does kind of obviously good character work with voters? Are voters more attracted to people who are obviously good people? It's not obvious to me that, although that can be the case, and I've known many, many politicians over the years, and I think of politicians as a group as being kind of no better or worse than the rest of us, and most of them are, rather complicated creatures with lots of ideals, quite a lot of personal ambition, just like you and me, sort of thing. Sadly, I don't think that saints necessarily typically do better at the polls than sinners do.
Oh, look, we've got a sea of hands. We'll have time for one more question, I think. Yeah, gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Andrew Greystone. You said, Mark, that you were unable to predict the future, but I'm going to tempt you. When I eventually retire in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time, do you think I will be able to sit on the sofa with a printed newspaper? And do you think I'll be able to watch a free-to-air public service television channel like the BBC?
No, and yes. No, I think it's unlikely it's very unlikely you'll be able to read a printed newspaper unless you've printed it yourself. I used to drive people mad at the New York Times by saying, we should just give everyone a printer. So overnight you could download and make a facsimile, and it would hopefully would make your coffee as well, so you could kind of pick up the paper and the coffee under the stairs.
Device, honestly.
I know, for some reason they laughed at me, but I think the economics, and by the way, printing and distributing newspapers, the New York Times, still 500,000 copies delivered to people's houses in the continental United States every morning before 7 o'clock. It's a landmass, more than 3,000 miles wide and sort of 12, 13, 1,400 miles deep. It's insane, and it's about the least environmentally friendly act you could do. So actually, your phone may be a very bad thing in some ways, but it's very good for the environment. You know what? I think the idea that the BBC might be around in 50 years' time, it won't be broadcast. It'll probably be internet protocol or whatever follows that. And it may be an AI kind of, idealized generic BBC presenter rather than a human being. But I think you will get something. You'll get something on your computer or your phone. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, well, that's really encouraging.
Well, we could just borrow your face and your voice.
I know. I'll be long gone by then. Listen,
that's the point.
Yeah.
It won't matter. You'll still be there.
Look, it's been absolutely fascinating to hear your thoughts. I know everyone here is incredibly grateful. And if we've achieved one thing, and I can see Chris Lamb at the back there, he's very excited about this, I know. It's the possibility, at least, of a religion tab on the CNN website. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Mark Thompson.